Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to this week's discussion about records, the nature of records. So here are our weekly topics. What is or are the purpose or purposes of records? What is the records lifecycle model? What kinds of records are in archives? And which characteristics do records possess? So we'll be looking at 4 of our course learning objectives this week. We'll touch on ethics and social responsibilities a little bit, but maybe not enough to warrant a full mention here. But we'll kind of touch on all 5, but mostly focus on these 4 here. So we will start by looking at the life cycle of the record, at least sort of the traditional representation of the life cycle of the record that archives have traditionally followed, that many archives still follow today, although, as we'll discuss next week, there is another representation of how records sort of progress through time, known as the continuum model. We'll touch on that next week, because if we talked about it this week, it would be a really long lecture. So we'll just focus on the more traditional life cycle this week, and then next week we'll talk about the continuum model. So here we go. So you have the creation of the record, the use by the person that created the record, either the retention or disposal of the record. So if the record is disposed of, then it kind of goes in the trash, or whatever happens to it, it gets deleted from hard drive, and things end there. If it is retained, then it survives and ends up in an archive. And so again, this is going to be just a fragment of the overall information that a person creates, as we talked about last week. And so these fragments are appraised by archivists, and they may be acquired. Again, an archivist may say, no, we don't want these, in which case they would get disposed and thrown out as well, and that would kind of end things. But we'll assume here that an archivist appraises the record and says, yes, we would like to bring these into the archive. Then the records are accessioned, and they're given sort of rudimentary access information. They're arranged and described, and is even further enhanced. And then the records are available for reference work, researcher services, and they become more accessible. And throughout the time that records are in archives, they are being preserved in some shape or form, ideally. So again, this is a simplification of the actual process that records go through, but we'll just kind of go with this for the time being. So this first stage here is, or this first sort of initial series of steps is what I like to call the ingredients stage, or the ingredients part of the life cycle of the record, because these different stages are going to determine which ingredients archives have when they are making the archival meal that researchers see before them. So these stages really determine which records archives have to apply subsequent things like arrangement description, reference, increased access to them. So obviously, if a record doesn't survive, then those records aren't available for archivists to work with further. And you could also argue that the more information that archives get about the records during these stages can also make the ingredients better. So more information about why the record was created, or how the record was used by someone, what purpose or function was it used for, why it was retained instead of being disposed. And all of these questions and all this research is a part of the appraisal process that archives engage in, ideally. And so that's something that we'll be talking about later on. But all of these questions and all this information that archives can develop or learn more about during this ingredient stage can allow additional steps by archivists to be better and to be a better quality. So you could argue that asking these questions and getting this information makes the ingredients better. And you have a better ingredients, you're going to have a better meal for researchers to eat further down the line. So next we have the now you're cooking stage. So this is where archivists have the ingredients that they have, whatever quality, whatever number of ingredients are left. And this is where they do things like accession records, which is when you sort of physically and administratively bring the records into the archives. It's where you arrange and describe them. And it's where you provide reference and perhaps enhance access to the records. And I want to actually go back and talk a little bit more about this ingredient stage. This is a stage that can really be highly influenced by the creators that were listed in the Douglas article that we read last week. So the individual traditionally thought of as being the creator, the community that the creator belongs to, any custodian that might be taking care of the records for a period of time, and the archivists themselves. So a lot of these different parties can have a lot of say in, especially, which records are retained. So whether it's the person originally creating the records deciding to retain certain records and dispose of other records, whether it is the individual's community or family that's deciding whether to retain or dispose records, and then kind of secondarily, in the appraisal stage, just the archivist deciding whether to retain or dispose of records. So just to kind of apply this idea of creatorship to this life cycle, a lot of these creators are going to influence which ingredients are the now we're cooking stage that we just talked about. So again, the last slide here really focuses on sort of deciding which records are going to make up the archival fragment that we talked about last week. And this stage is going to focus on making the archival fragment more accessible and usable for researchers. So it's going to take what might be a big mass of records and provide just more information about the records, more increase the ability for researchers to actually discover what's in a collection, learn more about the records, about the person that created and used the records, and it's just going to make the fragment more accessible and usable. So the idea is that at the end of the day, you have the perfect archival collection for researchers to work with. So one that, as we talked about last week, represents things factually, one that represents diverse perspectives as much as possible, one that is accessible and easy for researchers to use, one that connects to other fragments, one that is as organic as possible. That's all the ones that I've had. I think I might be missing one, but the idea is that all these things are present in this archival fragment that researchers have to work with, that there are high quality ingredients, that archivists have taken the steps to make this fragment as useful to researchers as possible, so that researchers are presented with this perfect archival collection to do research with. But as we know, this is very difficult to have happen in practice because of the creative/media roles that records creators play over time. So, the perfect archival collection would contain every record about an individual or about an organization, or at least every record about an individual or an organization that documented the important aspects of that person or organization's existence. But, as we know, as we talked about, things get thrown away. Things are sort of misdescribed or misinterpreted by archivists, and that results in an archival collection that may be really artificial and may have a lot of flaws and may have diminished research value. And again, archivists just kind of have to accept that this is an inevitability and an attempt to describe to researchers what might have happened during these different stages of the life cycle model, that lets them know, so the archivist can let them know why what they're looking at may be less than perfect, and why some things are missing, or why there are only certain perspectives represented in a collection, and at least provide some kind of background or some kind of awareness about why the collection is in the shape that it is. And again, that just gives researchers a more informed perspective about what they're looking at, and perhaps encourages them to attempt to find additional sources to corroborate any information that they see or don't see in the collection that they're looking at. So, basically the life cycle model is full of opportunities for failure, full of opportunities for decisions made by records creators or mediative acts by archivists to diminish the overall quality of an archival collection. And, again, that's just kind of inevitable, and archivists just kind of have to roll with it and do the best they can with what they have. Maybe, as I talked about just now and talked about last week, work with records creators to get more of an idea of what might have been in the collection, what might have been taken out, encourage records creators to preserve records in a way that is beneficial for their long-term survival, and that can make it more likely that something that is closer to perfect will survive. But the perfect archival collection doesn't exist. That's just something that archivists kind of aspire to, and something that I'm sure researchers would enjoy as well. So all of the factors that I have listed here, these factors that have shaped the evolution of the archival profession over time, so changes in the use of records, the changing nature of records, an increase in the number of records, an increase in the complexity of subjects, and changing ideas about what archives should document, and again, this is one of our course learning objectives, have shaped how archives have navigated this traditional life cycle of records. So, for instance, the changing nature of records has led to preservation generally being more difficult. An increase in the number of records has led to appraisal being more time-consuming. You could argue that an increase in the complexity of subjects that archives attempt to document has made arrangement and description more difficult, just because there might be bureaucracies that are more complex and larger, and so that results in archives having to spend more time figuring out how all these different parts of a person's life or parts of an organization are related, and conveying those relationships to researchers, through the form of a finite or some other access tool. You could argue that changing ideas about what archives should document have impacted appraisal choices that an archive might make. So today, more people may feel that archives should focus on diverse voices and focus on social justice. And so that may lead archivists to work harder to acquire those records and make sure that they're preserved in archives in the long run. So just some connections between some of these different factors that have influenced archives and how they might impact the traditional life cycle of the record that we just looked at. So let's shift gears a little bit here and talk about what is a record. So what constitutes sort of the gears and cogs of archives, the very kind of microscopic molecules that together make up the collections, which make up the holdings that are found in archives. So this is a definition of the record, or of a record, from the essay Glossary of Archival Terms. I'm not going to read this because we're going to go over some bits and pieces of it and kind of pick at it here in just a second. So here I have this first section here highlighted, that a record is in part a written or printed work of a legal or official nature. And I'm not sure that I necessarily agree with that because, if you think about personal archives, which the Douglas article for this week was really focused on, very personal archives, you know, are those of a legal or official nature? No, it seems like the purpose for those records is more informal, just to, remember someone. But, obviously there are still records. So uh, it seems like the existence of personal archives doesn't really mesh with this idea that a record needs to be of a legal or official nature. A written or printed work, again, that's not necessarily something that applies to a lot of records either. So, is a toy printed or written? I guess, I don't know. I'm not sure. Is a ritual, which the Douglas article talks about, is that written or printed? No, not really. So, just right off the bat here, we have a couple of parts of this definition of the record that seem um, a little prescriptive and maybe not entirely modern. Next, we have this idea that a record should be fixed on some medium, that it has content, context, and structure. So we'll talk about some different characteristics of records, and those do include, fixity, content, and context. Structure is just kind of confusing, so we won't worry about that one too much. But if you look at this idea of being fixed on some medium, again, to look at the idea of rituals, which Douglas mentions uh, in their article for this week, is a ritual ever fixed on some kind of medium or in some tangible form? Maybe not, but you could argue that it is something that meets a lot of the other qualifications of what is and isn't a record, some of which we'll talk about in just a minute. So again, that's just another way that this definition of an article um, might be a little bit traditional and doesn't really encompass all the ways which information can be expressed and conveyed. Next, we'll look at this idea that a record is something that's used as an extension of human memory or to demonstrate accountability, and is something that's evidence of an activity for future reference. And the Douglas article is full of different types of records that are used as an extension of human memory. Um, you know, Memory of a life lived, and these records really seek to extend the memory of someone that has passed on. So, you could argue that, things like the toys and tattoos and blankets and other types of records that are mentioned in the Douglas article really fit, especially this aspect of what a record is and what a record does. And I feel like this is the aspect of a record that would probably garner the most agreement, or the most support among all types of archivists, that they do serve as extensions of human memory, that they do serve as evidence of some kind of activity for future reference. I think it's interesting that this definition implies some kind of conflict between something that is either used as an extension of human memory or to demonstrate accountability, because I feel like those two are actually pretty strongly related. If you can extend human memory about a person or about an event or an organization, then that increases the ability of an individual or the ability of a community to hold someone accountable for what they've done, right? So I'm not really sure why it says or to demonstrate accountability, because I don't really feel like there's necessarily a conflict between those two concepts. So again, just to kind of pick at this definition a little bit. You can tell that this definition of records comes from a sort of Western uh, evidential background, because it does talk about evidence of that activity for future reference. So, when you think of evidence, you think of, certain characteristics that a record needs to have in order for it to be considered as evidence, like evidence in a court of law, or in kind of a judicial setting. And it's important to think about which characteristics of a record are important for a record to be able to serve as a piece of evidence. And two big ones are fixity and authenticity, which we will discuss later on in this lecture. So overall, what that definition suggests to me is that, as Douglas states in the Douglas article for this week, personal and intimate records may not conform to traditional concepts of what a record is or what a record should do. So there may be types of records which may be very personal and intimate that don't meet this sort of traditional concept of what a record is or what a record should be able to do. And I think that that really speaks to uh, a disconnect between personal and intimate archives and records and this sort of traditional concept of what a record is. Um, and I think that that really has to do with the function that personal and intimate archives uh, seek to document or represent, and the form that this function uh, is presented in, or the form of the record that documents a particular function. And there is a pretty strong relationship here. So if a record is meant to serve in a particular function, then I feel like that's going to influence the overall characteristics of that record. And maybe the format that the record is on, um, how able a record is to serve as a piece of evidence. There's going to be a strong overlap between function and form when it comes to records, and what they look like and what sort of format or what form they take. And I think that you could argue that functions documented in personal archives may not be traditionally thought of as being archival, people may think, well, personal archives are sort of less archival because of their personal nature, and because personal archives don't really meet the evidential threshold for records that we like to see in archives. And the form that personal archives take may not be traditional archival either. So again, looking at some of the examples that are mentioned in the Douglas article, so things like tattoos, things like blankets, things like rituals and toys. And the article does talk about incorporating more official records like hospital records and other things that were created by the hospital, but there's definitely a strong representation of personal archives as well. And we'll talk later on in the semester about the distinction between personal and organizational archives, but it does seem to me, and it does, Douglas suggests that this is true in their article as well, that there is kind of this disconnect between personal records and this traditional notion of an archive, this traditional nature of records. And again, I think that speaks to the bias that archives have had traditionally in thinking of some records as being more archival than others, and in turn valuing certain records over other records. And we talked last week about the mediative role that archives have in determining sort of what's available for researchers to look at. And I think when archives start to make those kinds of decisions that, some records meet the criteria for being archival and other records don't, that's when we come into this idea of archives reflecting and reinforcing social values, because they're saying, well, we really only think that records are archival if they meet, this, this, and this. There may be records that don't meet this and this and this, and because archives don't value them, because they don't have all these sort of defined characteristics of what a record is, then they're kind of left by the wayside. And that can result in records that meet, a very strict criteria and are actually fairly homogeneous in both their content and in their form and structure, being represented in archives, and types of records that don't meet that criteria being left out of archives. And it just kind of goes back to this idea of archives being an echo chamber that just kind of, reinforce and regurgitate the values that they see in society, instead of being more um, being more open to accepting records which may not necessarily reflect the sort of evidential values of what a record is thought of as needing to be in order to be important. And so again, that means records that are more personal, more intimate, records that maybe have formats or even content that may differ from the sort of traditional dry bureaucratic evidential type records that archives have traditionally valued. So basically, by saying this is what a record is and this is what a record isn't, archives are making a value judgment, and they are making a mediation to favor one type of record over the other, and that comes at a loss of a lot of really important and valuable information, which might be found in these more personal and intimate archives. And that can result in a lot of perspectives and a lot of voices being lost to history and kept out of archives. So let's move on to talking more about some of the different characteristics that records have. So we have content, We have fixity, which is kind of optional. We'll talk about that in a minute. Uniqueness, context, and then authenticity, which again is kind of an interesting one to explore. And we'll look at these sort of slightly out of order. But yeah, we'll just kind of talk about all these different characteristics and connect them to some of the discussions that we've had in class and some of our readings as well. Okay, so a big one is content, which is, pretty straightforward. As Miller describes on page 12, the text, images, sounds, or other information that makes up the substance of a record. So, you look at this picture here, you would say the content is a glass jar, there's water in it, looks like someone's pouring water into it, so there are drops of water. It looks like maybe there are grapes imprinted into the glass, and so on. That's the content of this picture. But it's important to understand that when an archivist describes the content of a record, that's an act of creation. That is something that is going to shape a researcher's understanding of what they're looking at. If you say in a fine aid, this is the content of a folder or of a record, that's what the researcher is going to kind of accept at face value. They might think, okay, that's interesting, and go and look more and be like, oh, well, this actually uh, isn't what this part of the fine age says. This is something totally different. Um, but it is an act of creation by archivists. It's sort of naming something and saying, this is what this is. And again, archivists can get it right, they can get it wrong, but whatever they do, it's an act of creation that can influence how a researcher um, interacts with and understands a record. And it's important to note that the content of a record can change over time. So, as time progresses, the physical attributes of a record may change. The text on a letter might start to fade. It might, get blurry or whatever. Images might start to kind of warp or be less sharp. Sounds might distort as the physical media that the sounds are on starts to decay. So inevitably, over time, content is going to change, no matter how carefully you attempt to preserve it. And so that is going to lead to a lot of challenges to the next characteristic of records that I'm going to talk about, which is this idea of fixity. So this idea that a record must not be changed intentionally or unintentionally, or it may no longer serve as evidence of the transaction or event that it documented. So essentially, Miller is saying if a record changes over time, that diminishes the evidential value that a record has. And as I just talked about, changes to fixity are inevitable. So there's no sort of perfect preservation plan or system that's going to keep everything the same as it was for all of eternity. And it's very likely that even before a record came into archives, it's already changed from how it was when it was originally created, especially if a record was changed or was created in 1975 and archivists don't even look at it until 30 or 40 years later. So for the very beginning, what an archivist is seeing and working with may differ perhaps greatly from what the record was like when it was created however many years ago. So changes in fixity are inevitable, and they may be based on intentional choices that some of the creators that we've talked about have made, or they may be unintentional choices. But all the different types of creators that we talked about can make choices that influence fixity and how closely a record is compared to how it looked when the record was originally created. And this really goes back to this idea of archives as being unstable places. So places where records are constantly changed, where fixity is constantly sort of under siege. And, you know, really the best that archivists can do is attempt to be aware of these changes and document them as much as possible so that researchers are able to look at a record and understand that, yes, this record has changed over time, and how it looks now may not be what it looked like when it was originally created. And that way they can make those considerations when they are determining the evidential value of a record that they're looking at. And so this idea of fixity is really strongly connected with this idea of authenticity, which is a really key a key aspect of a record, especially when you are again looking at the ability of a record to serve as evidence of something, or you're attempting to use a record to hold someone or something accountable for their actions. So authenticity essentially demands that a record is what they purport to be. So if I am looking through a collection and I find a letter that says it was written, you know, from George Washington to Alexander Hamilton, in order for that record to be authentic, that has to be the case. You know, it had to be George Washington who sat down one day and wrote that letter to Alexander Hamilton. If it turns out that it was actually, you know, George Washington's assistant who wrote that letter and signed it in his name, or if it was, you know, someone else writing that letter on George Washington's behalf, then that really brings into question the authenticity of that record, because it's saying, well, I'm a letter from George Washington, but no, in actuality, it was a letter, you know, written by someone who had some association with George Washington, but not George Washington himself. And so the provenance of that letter may be brought into question. An authentic letter doesn't necessarily have to be false. It can contain, you know, accurate and truthful information. But again, if it is not what it purports to be, then that can make the record inauthentic. And so again, there's this connection between fixity and authenticity. If a record changes so much over time, if the fixity is so poorly maintained, then the record that the researcher is looking at may differ so much from what the record was like when it was created that, you know, for all intents and purposes, it's a completely different record. You know, it's not an authentic representation of what the record, you know, looked like, and you know, how the record actually was. It was initially created by the record creator. And this is a huge issue, especially when I think about electronic records and digital records and digital record preservation, because as we'll talk about later on in this course, sometimes archivists need to take steps to preserve digital records that can change them quite significantly, and that can really lead to questions about, okay, so is this even the same record that it was when it was created, or is it sort of a whole nother record that was essentially, you know, 25 years later. And we'll talk about that more when we discuss activation here in a few weeks. So it's important to note that, as I just kind of touched on, the changing nature of records really has had a strong interaction with these issues of authenticity and fixity. So essentially, over time, records have gotten more and more fragile, and it's been more of a challenge to keep them fixed in a stable format, and that has led to more questions about how authentic records are. So, back in the days when everything was sort of chiseled into stone, which was very durable and could last, thousands of years without changing, to the digital records that a lot of, maybe the only type of record that a lot of people create, which are very fragile and can be destroyed or changed very easily. That has really led to a lot of challenges in maintaining the fixity and authenticity of records. And it's been a big issue that archivists have been attempting to address more or less for the last, 40 years. And it's also important to think about if there are collections that are really large. That may make it more difficult for archivists to preserve this authenticity in collections where there may be, thousands of records, just because it's more of a task to migrate all those records and to keep track of all the changes in those records. So there are a couple of these key factors that have influenced archives that are really closely associated with these struggles to maintain fixity and authenticity. Okay, so another characteristic of records is this idea of uniqueness. So uniqueness not necessarily of the content of a record, but the context of the record. So, for instance, I may make a shopping list and give the same shopping list to 3 different people, and they go out and use it to buy different groceries at different stores. The context of each shopping list is unique because the shopping lists were used and interpreted in different ways by different people, even though it's the same list of ingredients in a recipe, or maybe like paper plate and shampoo. Someone may go out and buy one type of paper plate. Someone might go out and buy Head and Shoulders instead of Selsun Blue, heaven forbid. And so the actual implementation or interpretation and use of these shopping lists differs, even though it's the same list of things to buy from the store. And so this really connects closely with context, which is something that we'll talk about in just a minute. We'll talk about it right now. So context. This is an extremely important part of records and part of the nature of records. And, I like to say context is king, because in a lot of ways, context is as important or even more important than the content of a record when it comes to making records valuable and useful for researchers to interact with. So here is the definition, a couple of definitions of context. So one from the essay glossary of terms, and then one from the Miller chapter on pages 13 and 14. Essentially it's the who, what, where, and even possibly why. So who created the information, how the information was used and stored, why the information was created all the important details that researchers want to know about a particular record. So if we look at this hypothetical map, you look at this and say the content of this map is, an image of the United States, and it shows some kind of trail with an X at the end. There's a compass in what looks like an ocean, and that's all well and good, but the context provides such a deeper understanding of exactly who used this map. What was it used for? When was it created? Why was it created? How was it used? Um, this contextual information just provides a whole lot of detail that you can't really get just by looking at the content of a record. So, the content might be pretty straightforward. And so it's important to know this contextual information surrounding the record, or the overall value of the record can be quite poor. And so that goes back to this idea of the purpose of records, or the purpose of, an individual record. And I would argue quite strongly that, the purpose of a record is determined by the person using them. So people might use the same record for 10 different ways. And it just kind of depends on what their information need is when they are looking at a collection or looking at a record. I might use a poster for just because I think it's something cool and something that I want to hang in my wall. Another person might use the same poster to, critique the aesthetics of propaganda posters during World War I, or to understand, the propaganda efforts by the United States government during World War I. So there are a lot of different purposes that records can serve, and it's going to be kind of subjective from person to person and from need to need. But I would argue, and I think a lot of archivists would agree with me, maybe even every archivist would agree with me, that the better the content and context of a record are preserved, the more able the record is of serving any purpose that it might be used for. So if you have content that is preserved very well, and you have context that is preserved very well, and both these things are presented to researchers, that results in records that are more valuable, or records that are going to be more likely to constitute the perfect archival record, or the perfect archival collection, as we talked about before. These types of records are going to be very strong ingredients for the archival stew that we're going to ladle out to researchers when they come into the reading room. So it speaks to the importance of getting a lot of information about the content of records from records creators, and also important information about the context of records as well. Because if you have one but not the other, then that really starts to diminish the value of the record and how capable it is of meeting the purpose of researchers. Okay, to talk a little bit more about the nature of records, you can ask, are records neutral? Almost never, because they're from someone or something's perspective, or bias. Are records accurate? No, not all the time. Whether intentionally or unintentionally, records can not be factual. And are records reflections of power? Quite possibly, yes. Oftentimes it is people in society who, are educated, who are literate, who are creating records, especially, in the old days when literacy wasn't as widespread as it is today. They were the ones that were able to express themselves in records, or at least in a format of records which was widely regarded as being, the most important types of records to collect by archivists. So if you were able to, write something down because you were literate, then archivists may give that more credence than something like an oral history, which only requires the ability to speak. Even though both types of records might be equally valid, traditionally archivists may prefer to have something in this sort of written fixed form and not something which may sort of change from time to time or from person to person. So it's just kind of important to be aware of some of the power dynamics that go behind just the creation of records, and how those power dynamics have influenced archives and what archives have chosen to collect over time. One really interesting perspective about the nature of records um, is this idea of the infinite archive in the Keteler article that we looked at for this week. So this idea that the meaning of a record never changes, that it will be reactivated again and again, and that every time a creator, user, or archivist sort of interacts with the record or interrogates the record or mediates in some way with the record, that sort of reopens the record. And Keteler describes these activations as leaving fingerprints, which are attributes of the archive's infinite meaning. So a record is never finished, never complete. The record is always in the process of becoming. So again, traditionally archivists like to think of records as being created for a specific purpose, and that's sort of the beginning and the end of, what the record is. X person created X record for X reason, and that's sort of the beginning and the end. But Keteler would argue that no, every time we kind of relook at records and reinterpret what they are, that sort of reopens them to subsequent sort of reinterpretation and additional interrogation. So as I talked about just now, a record is made to document a decision or event, and that record has one meaning. And so traditionally, archivists would say, okay, that's it. That's all the record is. That's all it stands for. But say 10 years later, the same record is used by a researcher for a reason unrelated to the record's creation. The record then takes on a different meaning, or I guess you could say an additional meaning. And this process can continue. Maybe another researcher comes along and uses the record for a different purpose, and that provides sort of an additional layer of meaning to the record. And this can lead to the record being activated in different ways. And as we talked about last week, these activations can be considered creative acts as well. They can really shape these archival fragments that we talked about. They can lead to records or collections being regarded as less or more important. They can influence how they are viewed by the archive itself or by researchers and the general public. They can really influence how a researcher understands the collection that they're looking at when they go to do archival research, or the records that they're looking at. So, you can also kind of think of this as relating to the different characteristics of records that we talked about. So, an activation may change how I view the content of a record. It may lead us to reinterpret the words that George Washington wrote to Alexander Hamilton, or to the photograph of a historical event that, subsequent research determines is actually different from how archivists or researchers originally interpreted it. Activations may lead to changes in our understanding of a record's authenticity. So if we go back, and look at that letter that's supposedly from George Washington to Alexander Hamilton, and we think, well, this handwriting doesn't actually look like George Washington's. And so it may be that this letter wasn't actually written by George Washington. Again, maybe it was written by his assistant or whomever. There was this case recently where there were some paintings by the painter Basquiat in, I think it was the Orlando Museum of Art. And, this guy was claiming, hey, these are Basquiat paintings. And so the art museum was going to do an exhibit around them. And then people started looking at these paintings and they're like, well, we actually don't think that these are authentic Basquiats. And I guess someone looked at like a FedEx shipping label that was on one of the paintings and realized that the font used on that shipping label was introduced in like the 90s after Basquiat was already dead. And so that really led people to think, okay, well, maybe these aren't authentic after all. So again, this sort of additional interrogation or additional activation of these paintings led people to kind of question how authentic they really were. Certainly additional research or additional activations can lead people to reinterpret the context of records. So the who, what, where, when, and why. Maybe the context behind a record was initially thought to be one thing, but additional research suggests that it was actually something different. So there are a lot of ways that this idea of activation, that these fingerprints that researchers can add, can really change the characteristics of records as archivists and researchers understand them. And, I think that's a good thing, if it results in a more accurate understanding of the content and context and authenticity and fixity of a record, that's only going to benefit the public, because they're just going to have more accurate information about the records that they're working with and be able to derive more factual meanings from those records. So, this can certainly be a positive process for the value of archival records. And this idea of even caring about the use of records that may differ from why the record was originally created represents a change in the use of records in the archival profession. So, there was a time where no one would really care about any topics or any uses of the record that differ from why the record was originally created. So again, if the record was created to convey information from George Washington to Alexander Hamilton, that was kind of the end all and the be all. And no one really saw, or not many people really saw the value in saying, okay, well, what does this letter say about, the conditions of George Washington's army during the Revolutionary War, or, the use of enslaved people by revolutionary troops during the Revolutionary War, or all these different sort of layers of context and meaning that we can get from this collection. So just being interested in what these different activations can bring to bear connects with this idea of changes in the use of records shaping the archival profession. And so related to that is this concept of freedom from my file that the Keeler article talks about. So this idea of liberating the file from the context of the record creator and thinking more of the subject of the record as being a party to the record. So someone who is represented in Stasi records actually having some say in, who accesses those records, or who can, or how those records should be preserved, or even if they should be preserved at all. And so when this happens, records about people become records owned by them. So it represents a pretty fundamental shift in power, which is something related to social justice, which we'll talk about later on in the semester. And there are also connections to personal archives, and we'll talk about those later on in the semester as well. I will say that this sort of idea of freedom from my file isn't one that is kind of widely implemented in archives, because again, archival tradition kind of speaks against the idea that if the person hasn't created the file, then they're just sort of the subject of the record, and not a co-creator or not a part of the record. But I think that it is a pretty interesting process that can, as I just mentioned, uh, allow archives to more support social justice issues. So to kind of empower people that may have been disempowered in organizational or governmental records to have some say over how they are represented in archival records. So to go back to this idea of a map, so say this map was related to some kind of expedition, and that expedition resulted in exploitation or harm to people located during the expedition. They would have the context of their experience attached to the record and have some say in record keeping decisions surrounding it. So, again, kind of transforming the victim to someone that has power in record keeping decisions surrounding a particular record. And so you can connect this to the ideas of memory justice and memory truth that Ketelar discusses in his article. So, one is really focused on records have evidential value. They're sort of a beginning and an end. There really isn't any interest in healing trauma. It's just sort of just the facts, ma'am. Whereas memory truth is more focused on things like collective memory, narrative unity, representing different perspectives, and also opening up records to this idea of reinterpretation and activation. And memory justice is probably more in line with sort of how archives have traditionally approached records and the nature and purpose of records. But you could argue that this memory truth concept is one that is maybe more humanitarian, more modern, and is more capable of archives operating in a way that is sort of more loving and more understanding of the emotional issues that records can document and can record. And that's something that the Douglas article talks about. The effective nature of records suggests that they should be approached from more of a memory truth or loving perspective than kind of the cold clinical memory justice perspective that archives have traditionally operated under. And so again, that really goes to changing ideas about what archives should document. So wanting to be more careful and thorough about documenting these collective memories, and documenting these reinterpretations that take place and really adding them to the overall fabric of the record that researchers have to work with and interact with when they are doing research in an archive. Okay, so we will call it there. I hope that I hope that this lecture has helped you learn more about records and kind of a reappraisal of some things we've already talked about, and just sort of more information about some of the different topics that we will discuss during the rest of this course. So yeah, I hope it was interesting. As always, if you have any questions, please let me know, and take care.